Supercuts!
We are not professing to tell you the complete story of these activities. We are professing to tell you the complete story that we know.
Right.
But these records that we've uncovered don't tell the story. They tell pieces of it.
This program is made possible by financial support from viewers like you.
Every so often, it feels like Congress rediscovers MKUltra. Then it fades again. Then it comes back. 1977. The 1980s in Canada. The 1990s here in the United States again. And now, once again in 2026, lawmakers are sitting in a hearing room in Washington trying to make sense of one of the strangest and most disturbing intelligence programs ever acknowledged by the U.S. government. There are already plenty of documentaries out there that would tell you what MKUltra was in a very clean, packaged way. That's not really what I'm interested in here. What I want to understand is something a little deeper. Why does this story keep resurfacing? Why does it refuse to stay buried? And what, if anything, is actually different this time? But to even start answering that, we have to go back to the beginning. So let's go back to 1953. The Cold War is in full swing. And in Washington, the atmosphere is something close to paranoia. Maybe justified, maybe not, depending on how you look at it. The Soviet Union is the primary enemy. Communist China is rising. And inside American intelligence circles, there's a growing fear that the United States is already behind in something far more subtle than missiles or tanks. The belief, right or wrong, is that enemy governments may have figured out how to influence human behavior itself. Not just interrogation, not just torture, but something closer to what people would later call mind control. Now, whether that was actually happening anywhere is almost secondary. What matters is that the people running the CIA believed it was a real possibility. And once that belief takes hold at that level, it tends to produce consequences. So the CIA director, Alan Dulles, authorizes a new research initiative. The program is given a code name, MKUltra. The name itself doesn't really mean anything dramatic. MK was just an internal CIA classification prefix. Ultra was essentially arbitrary. No hidden symbolisms, no secret philosophy behind it, just bureaucracy, which, in a strange way, almost makes it more unsettling. Because what followed behind that ordinary name was anything but ordinary.
And what's interesting to me as a theologian and as a biblical scholar is the messaging. There are a number of people in the field, they would attribute it to very human causes and brainwashing techniques. Okay? People abused in various ways and various reasons and given screen memories, something to remember in place of this. Okay, this is a very weird, vast field that has deep roots in some very esoteric subjects that sound like they can't be real. like mind control, MKUltra.
This is a story that has been told in bits and pieces. This is an attempt to pull most of it together. We know we don't have the full story. We do, however, have some striking new revelations and insights. The story begins here, just off the nation's front yard, the Mall. The buildings behind me were the headquarters for the World War II Office of Strategic Services. It was here that the first halting steps toward mind control began. The shaper and molder of OSS was General Wild Bill Donovan. He said of his group's work, "We may have made mistakes, but we were not afraid to try things that were never done before." In this anything-goes atmosphere, Donovan appointed this man, Stanley Lovell, a Boston industrialist, to break new ground in many scientific and technical fields. Donovan called Lovell his Dr. Moriarty, after the fiendish professor in Sherlock Holmes. Lovell liked the name and posed for this Saturday Evening Post photo. He later wrote of his OSS job that it was, quote, to stimulate the PEC's bad boy beneath the surface of every American scientist and to say to him, throw all of your normal law-abiding concepts out of the window. Here's a chance to raise merry hell. It was in this atmosphere that the search for mind control began. This bizarre man would be an active participant in that search over the next 2 decades. His name is George White, an OSS captain who had formerly been with the Bureau of Narcotics. In his diary, seen here publicly for the first time, White left a legacy of the darker side of American intelligence work. He received his early OSS training at the British-run school at Oshawa, Canada, the same school where Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, was trained. White referred to the school in his diaries as the Oshawa School of Mayhem and Murder. Mike Burke, former OSS colleague of White's and now president of Madison Square Garden Center.
Very compelling fellow, mysterious fellow, almost mystical fellow. He was fascinating because you knew something about him, but not enough about him to really get a fix on him. He also knew a great deal about the swifter elements of society, the gamier side of life, and he was very impressive in his technical knowledge of the underworld, so to speak.
He said, one of our men gets beat up. He says, you have to act real fast and teach these guys a lesson.
Charles Siragusa, a former narcotics officer and friend of White's.
He'll come around, he says, and break your kneecaps. And with that, one guy laughed, and George would always have a little Billy with him. And this one guy sort of naked. George White turned around and whapped him across the neck with it. Then he picked up a pool stick and started beating everybody up.
He made his point.
And he made his point.
George White was not a man of understatement or subtleties. His boss at OSS, Stanley Lovell, referred to him as deadly and dedicated. In this note from White's diaries, it says, call Lovell regarding TD. TD was a rather transparent cover for Truth Drug. George White worked with the Truth Drug Committee here at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the nation's capital. They experimented with mescaline, scopolamine, and marijuana on unwitting victims. The committee soon learned there was no easy panacea, no truth drug at this stage. But White and later colleagues would not stop trying. The goal remained the same. As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation. But it was a discovery here in Basel, Switzerland, at Sandoz Laboratories by Dr. Albert Hoffman, that led the intelligence agencies of America to believe that they had found the panacea. The discovery was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The film that you see is considered by many experts to be the closest illustration of the effects of a hallucinogenic.
It was one of the first times that anybody had run into a powerful drug that was different than anything else that they knew anything about.
John Gittinger, recently retired chief psychologist for the CIA. This is the first time Gittinger has been interviewed publicly.
We could disable a whole city by putting a very small amount on a water supply. After all of these years of us, those of us who were involved in looking for this secret drug, this was the only thing that began to look for the first time like it might be something like that.
The CIA's interest in LSD was intense. The worry was that the Russians would get hold of it. Were the Soviets into LSD?
I'm going to have to say I'm sure they were, but if you ask me to prove it, I've never seen any direct proof of it.
But at one point, intelligence information received from Switzerland said that Sandoz Laboratories was about to put 100 million doses of LSD on the open market. And it caused enough concern within the agency that the United States was prepared to buy the entire supply. However, a slight mistake had been made. The mistake is made public for the first time.
I just found out on a new CIA document that there were no such large quantities of LSD on the market.
John Marks has filed numerous Freedom of Information suits against the CIA and has unearthed much new material. He is the author of The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, a history of intelligence agency work with mind control. He is a consultant for this report.
What happened is that there was a military attaché in Switzerland, an American officer, who got milligrams and kilograms mixed up. In other words, he made a mistake of thinking 1/1000th of a gram was the same as 1,000 grams, which is a mistake of 1,000,000 times. So when the CIA got the intelligence that there were 100 million doses on the market, in fact, there were 100 doses.
MKUltra wasn't a single experiment or a single facility. It was an umbrella program. Under that umbrella sat at least 149 separate sub-projects spread across universities, hospitals, prisons, and private research institutions, over 80 in total, in the United States and abroad. And here's where things start to shift from abstract history into something much more uncomfortable. A lot of the people and institutions involved didn't actually know they were working for the CIA. Funding was often routed through front organizations, private foundations that looked legitimate on paper, but existed primarily to conceal the true source of the money. So researchers believed they were doing independent scientific work. In reality, they were often working inside a classified intelligence pipeline without realizing it. At the center of much of this effort was a CIA chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. If you looked into MKUltra long enough, his name shows up everywhere. Under his oversight, a wide range of methods were explored. Everything from psychoactive drugs like LSD to hypnosis to sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, isolation, and electroshock treatments. Some of it was clinical in appearance. Some of it wasn't. And a significant portion of it, based on what has been confirmed through records and testimony, was conducted without informed consent. That means ordinary folks weren't always volunteers. Some were prisoners. Some were psychiatric patients. Some were military personnel. And in some cases, they were civilians who simply had no idea they were part of a government experiment at all.
The man who would oversee the CIA's research into drugs and most of the agency's behavior programs is this man, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview. In their never-ending search for the miracle weapon, CIA operatives searched here in the remote mountain areas of southern Mexico for what up to then had been considered a myth, magic mushrooms. They used this man, a part-time chemist for the CIA, to dupe this man, a vice president of a bank and an amateur mycologist or mushroom expert, to try to get to the magic mushrooms and turn them into a drug. But it would be the amateur, R. Gordon Wasson and his colleagues, who would win the race and develop the drug psilocybin from the magic mushrooms.
We went into the Mazatec area, far from the highways, remote from Mexico City. There we found that rotten bagasse, as it's called, bagasso, covered with mushrooms. These mushrooms I didn't know, had never seen. They were the sacred mushrooms.
Wasson would also discover and record the ancient mystical rites of the mushrooms from a local shaman or magical priestess, Maria Sabina.
And we were seeing incredible sights. They would go slowly or they would go fast as I ordained. All your senses are rendered acute. We say that you see visions, you see hallucinations, but that doesn't begin to tell the story. The hallucinations are only part of it. You hear sounds, you smell things. The night was thrilling.
Word of Wasson's discovery reached the CIA quickly. Dr. James Moore, a University of Delaware chemist, secretly served the CIA preparing deadly chemicals on short notice. Moore was instructed to get close to Wasson and accompany him on another trip to Mexico to get the magic mushrooms. Internal documents show the CIA felt a drug derived from the mushrooms could remain an agency secret. What in the world were they looking for with the magic mushrooms?
I think the best answer to that is that they were looking for fundamental information on compounds that would be capable of causing changes in behavior, changes in mental attitude.
Did you ever consider what would have happened if any of these substances were given to, say, unwitting people?
Oh, I don't remember having considered that specifically.
What if you... I trust perhaps you've thought about it.
Well, I haven't worried about it. Your question again, what would I have thought had I known that any
of these substances would
have been given to
unwitting persons?
You mean a hostile agent of another government?
No, I mean,
think that was probably one of the things they had in mind.
I mean, testing it out on an American citizen.
I guess I must seem very, very cold-blooded about this, but I don't recall ever having been very much preoccupied with that issue.
But many drugs were tested in this way. A decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA to do testing on unwitting Americans. As one CIA document says, such testing would be operationally realistic. A former CIA official who worked on these programs describes for the first time how the decision was made. He did not wish to be filmed or recorded. Thus his remarks are read by someone else.
I think every last one of us felt sorry to attempt this kind of thing. We knew we were crossing the line. Every decent kid knows he shouldn't steal, but he does it sometimes. We knew damn well we didn't want anyone else to know what we were doing.
The decision was made to do testing on unwitting victims. It was decided they should be on the fringes of society because they were most vulnerable.
It was the borderline underworld, prostitutes, drug addicts, and other small-timers who would be powerless to seek any kind of revenge in case they found out.
And as their predecessors had a decade earlier, the CIA turned to George White for help. White was now a high-ranking narcotics official, and by this time the stories about George White were legendary.
So the waiter says, "May I help you, monsieur?" And George White was busy talking with me. I paid no attention to the waiter, so the waiter tapped him on the shoulder, says, "May I help you, monsieur?" George White turned around, whipped his gun out, and stuck it in the guy's face like this in this crowded restaurant.
George White did not mind bending the law, and he knew the street well. He was the ideal choice for what the CIA had in mind.
We were Ivy League, white, middle class. We were naive, totally naive about this, and he felt pretty expert. He knew the whores, the pimps, the people who brought in the drugs.
White set up so-called safe houses for the CIA in New York, here in Greenwich Village, and later in San Francisco, in this hotel, and in an apartment atop Telegraph Hill with a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. While the existence of these safe houses was disclosed last year, details of what took place within them has not been told. A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
We did quite a study of prostitutes and their behavior. How do you take a woman who is willing to use her body to get money out of a guy to get him to talk about things which are much more important, like state secrets? We learned a lot about human nature in the bedroom. We started to pick up knowledge that could be used in operations.
There would be victims in all of this, but as the agency knew, they couldn't fight back. Some entries from George White's diaries. Clarice gets horrors. Janet, sky high. As one agency memo says, we have no answer to the moral question. The safe houses were not the only testing grounds. Millions of dollars would be spent on LSD research at universities throughout the country. And word would begin to spread on campus about this so-called mind-blowing drug. And suddenly, there was the counterculture of the 60s.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug. The fallout from that was that the young psychologists began taking it themselves, discovering that it was an intelligence-enhancing, consciousness-raising experience.
I know that some of the studies in which the CIA had supported used as subjects people who later became strong proselytizers of LSD. So, in that sense, yes, I think it did sustain the perpetuation of the use of the drug. And it's rather ironic, isn't it?
The counter case that I would make in relationship to that is to remember that the people who were doing the research were people who would be doing the research regardless of who was the sponsor. I don't think anybody working in that time in the remotest ever thought that it would blow up into the kind of thing that it did.
History will judge the role of the CIA and other intelligence agencies in unwittingly contributing to the counterculture of the 60s through their intense interest in LSD and other hallucinogenics. But for the moment at least, the argument can be made that the CIA helped usher in the age of Aquarius. Covering a span of history such as we are in this report, one can get sidetracked by the so-called glamour and mystery of espionage work or by the exotic qualities of some drugs. But what you can't lose sight of is what all of this would mean in terms of individual human beings. There would be deaths, there would be long-lasting and harmful effects. The best-known case is that of this man, Frank Olson, a chemist employed by the Army Chemical Corps, who in 1953 was slipped LSD unknowingly at a meeting with CIA officials. Shortly after that, Olson went into severe depression. He ended his life at this New York hotel by diving through a shaded closed window in his 10th floor room. Frank Olson was the first known fatality in the CIA's LSD program. Olson left behind a widow, Alice, and 3 children. But it would be years before they learned the real story of his death. Shortly after his suicide, Alice Olson was visited by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the man who had administered the drug, and by Robert Lashbrook, his deputy, who was the last person with Frank Olson the night of his death.
It was probably to check me out and see whether I was handling myself and handling the situation, whether I was hysterical. And I'm sure they left the house feeling ever so much better because I had been gracious and hospitable to them, so that I must have played right into their hand and made them feel fine.
23 years later, how did you feel about that meeting?
My anger was unbelievable at how I had been duped for this length of time, and the anguish which was unnecessary.
Anyone who knew during all of those years never told Alice Olson the real story of her husband's death. She would discover it by accident more than 2 decades later. In essence, it was a 22-year-long cover-up. Lyman Kirkpatrick was Inspector General of the CIA at the time of Frank Olson's death. But had not the Olson case occurred within the secret confines of the CIA, would not this case have been a prosecutable case? Perhaps manslaughter?
I would think definitely prosecutable, and certainly from the point of view of of Mr. Olson, why it should probably have been actionable.
Frank Olson's suicide slowed down the CIA's testing of LSD and other drugs, but only momentarily. The CIA was not the only government agency interested in the possibilities LSD and other drugs presented for mind control. The Army Chemical Corps first started working with the CIA and then branched off on its own. It too tested drugs on unwitting victims, and a death would result. The case of this man, Harold Blower, a tennis pro, seen here with his daughter Elizabeth, is well known. In 1953, Blower was a private patient at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He was given 5 injections of a mescaline derivative that was being tested secretly for the Army Chemical Corps. With the 5th injection, Harold Blower died. As with the Olson case, a 22-year cover-up followed, until finally the Army admitted the real details of Blower's death. Since the initial news stories of Harold Blower's death, close to 5,000 documents, previously classified, have been released by the Army and obtained by ABC News. They provide valuable insight into Army activities at the time of Blower's death and where the Army went from there with their own drug testing program. From a previously classified deposition of Dr. James Cattell, who administered the mescaline derivative, on the purpose of the drug testing, to produce symptoms similar to those that you see in schizophrenia, on how much the patient knew about all this. We didn't delineate all the possibilities of what might happen because then you contaminate your experiment. Cattell then relates that he never even knew what drug he had given Harold Blower because of the secrecy of the Army experiments. We didn't know whether it was dog piss. This was secret. This was a secret. We weren't in on it. We asked Blower's daughter Elizabeth for her reaction.
What? How can anybody react to that? I mean, that is so far from what you'd expect from a human being, never mind a doctor, never mind a professional specialist who's supposed to care about people's minds. It's unbelievable.
A suit filed by Elizabeth Barrett against the Army Chemical Corps is now pending in federal court. Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain. The chief researcher was Dr. Russell Monroe, now head of the psychiatry department at the University of Maryland. These are various progress reports written by Dr. Monroe and recently obtained by ABC News. From one of the progress reports, a report of a woman who had electrodes implanted in the brain and was then given LSD and other drugs. She became agitated, cried, lapsed into a trance-like state. Felt as if she were about to have a convulsion, experienced waves of darkness and light, had bizarre sensations in her neck and legs, said somebody was trying to manipulate her body. At this point, Dr. Monroe wrote that the woman was obviously having paranoid ideas. As a layperson, perhaps you can enlighten me. What therapeutic effect would the type of experiment that I just described have on a patient?
Well, the therapeutic effect would be indirect.
Was this patient aware that she was being given LSD?
Yes, I mean, they were told that they would be given some medication, And they took
specifically LSD?
Well, we told them, I don't think that they would have even known what LSD was then at the time. They were told that they were going to they would be given some medications which might make them feel worse.
Dr. Monroe, what do you think the Army Chemical Corps was looking for in all of this testing?
They were looking for an incapacitating agent, an agent that would not harm the person permanently, but would incapacitate them temporarily. That seemed like a humanistic way to wage a war, if war is necessary.
When James Thornwell was given LSD by Army intelligence in 1961, this time it was no experiment. This time the express purpose was to peel back Thornwell's brain to bear any secret within it. This time the Army had gone operational. Thornwell, as reported on ABC last January, was an Army private stationed in Orléans, France. Classified documents were missing from his unit. Thornwell became a suspect. His 2.5-month interrogation included administration of sodium pentothal, hypnosis, isolation, and deprivation of sleep. Army documents obtained by ABC News refer to this interrogation as conventional. Despite this severe questioning, Army intelligence was getting nowhere with Thornwell, and it was decided to slip him LSD. For 16 years, Thornwell never knew what had hit him. Tell me about the acid.
I'd rather not. It's a bad trip. It's a bad trip. That was a bad trip. The pain was so excruciating. Felt like somebody was sticking me with 1,000,000 pins. You know, just everywhere. Oh, it just... Oh.
You want to stop for me?
I walked around.
You want to stop?
Oh, I can talk. I lived through it. I lived through it. I lived through it.
No charges were ever brought by the Army against Thornwell. He was discharged for psychological disorders. But an Army psychiatric evaluation of Thornwell obtained by ABC News, one which was done prior to Thornwell having been given LSD, says of him, fairly cooperative, oriented, alert, and gave no evidence of psychosis or depression. From the Army's point of view, this type of LSD interrogation was a success. Other documents refer to the exploitability of interrogation subjects, cracking them, keeping them off balance mentally, and providing an economical, speedy, and productive aid to interrogation. From James Thornwell's point of view, it was no success. Thornwell still has serious problems. He's run through 2 marriages, he maintains he can't hold a job, can't concentrate, has nightmares, and feels socially and emotionally isolated. Last fall, Thornwell filed suit against the government in federal court. In a moment, we will examine the closest experimentation to brainwashing that we have uncovered. By far, the most chilling experiments we have uncovered took place at this Gothic estate called Ravenscrag, halfway up Mount Royal in Montreal. It houses the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry of McGill University. It was here that the CIA funded a series of experiments, severe experiments. The work was done by the Institute's then director, Dr. Ewan Cameron. It is the closest experimentation to brainwashing yet disclosed. His work, unprecedented in psychiatry, consisted of 3 areas which he called sleep therapy, psychic driving, and the ultimate depatterning. Dr. Maurice Dongier, current head of the Allen Memorial Institute.
In his psychic driving, so-called type of therapy, he would give the patient intensive electric treatment in order to make the patient regress deeply, become forgetful, and then he would attempt to implant new ideas in the mind of the patient.
Now, to a layman, it would appear that Dr. Cameron was trying to take the slate and wipe it clean, the slate being the mind. In other words, Brainwashing.
Exactly, that's a very good comparison.
Brainwashing.
Yes, to lie.
Val Orlico of Winnipeg, Canada, the wife of a member of the Canadian Parliament, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. She entered the Allen Memorial Institute because of severe depression. She describes for the first time publicly the LSD therapy and psychic driving treatment that she was given by Dr. Cameron.
And then the drug began to take hold very rapidly because it was an IV injection. And things became very furry and very frightening, and had a lot of sensations that it's very difficult to recall. Nobody explained it to me. Nobody ever asked me if I was willing to do it or anything.
He had this feeling that he would be able to get through the resistance of illness and to reach deep changes very quickly.
Did he?
I don't think that when you look at that in retrospect, the hopes that he had have been in any way fulfilled.
But Cameron would plunge on. The next step was what he called psychic driving. This involved almost endless tape-recorded messages and more drugs for the patient. Cameron wrote that this was the way to make direct controlled changes in personality.
I thought this was the coldest and most impersonal treatment that anybody could give to anybody in the world. And I became more and more despondent and more angry. I just became so despondent that I thought I can't live like this any longer. And I thought I would just go out and throw myself underneath the cars on McGregor. I stood on the curb of that street and I stood there and I thought, okay, go. Okay, go. And then I thought, what if you're not killed? What if you're just maimed? What if you don't die and you live and you can't even talk anymore? And I couldn't do it.
The most severe technique Cameron used was de-patterning. He described it as breaking up the existing patterns of behavior by means of intensive electroshock therapy with prolonged periods of sleep. He carried out these experiments in something he called the sleep rooms.
People in there were like babies. They cried and they were very disoriented. And we were very afraid of the sleep room. We used to walk very carefully against the side of the corridor that was opposite the sleep room with our backs to the wall when we'd go by.
Cameron used this combined sleep electroshock treatment on patients as long as 30 days. One patient he kept asleep for 65 days. Cameron retired, and his successor, Dr. Robert Cleghorn, ordered a follow-up study on the patients treated with Cameron's de-patterning method.
It showed that it was no more beneficial in its result than the use of more conservative methods.
But the follow-up study showed that 60% of those who had been de-patterned still had amnesia for periods of anywhere from 6 months to 10 years. That's quite a memory loss, isn't it?
That is a memory loss. Indeed it is. It's I think, more than desirable.
In retrospect, does Dr. Cameron's experimentation and his treatment appear harsh?
I would say yes. I mean, this forceful type of approach that I was describing to you is definitely, it can be said that it's harsh.
I wouldn't call it harsh. I would say it was harder on the staff than it was on the patients, because these people had to be fed and they had to be cared for and they had to be given sufficient fluid and food and toileted and so on and so forth. It was a very difficult thing for the staff to follow these patients properly and see that they did well.
Well, I'm glad he was concerned for the staff. But damn it all, I wouldn't. I could have maybe had a different kind of life. And that makes me angry and sad, and I don't know how to explain how I feel, really. I just...
How did you feel when you learned that Dr. Cameron's experimentation was financed by the CIA?
Well, I thought, I can't even use the word that I thought, because I thought, that bastard. And he was too smart. He knew who he was working for. And, excuse me, but I just can't, sometimes I can't believe it, and yet I know it's true.
If you had the opportunity to say something to the people at the Central Intelligence Agency who financed this study, what would you say?
I realize the CIA is a very important organization, and they have a very important job to do. But, God, it surely doesn't have to be done on people who are totally incapable of knowing what's happening or having any defense against it. And I can't imagine the mentality of people who would do this. I just can't.
As for Dr. Cameron, he died in 1966 while mountain climbing. A colleague wrote of Cameron, "For him, the ends justified the means. And when one is dealing with the waste of human potential, it is easy to adopt this stance." Dr. Cameron seemed ideally suited for what the CIA had in mind. It was the Cold War, and especially the trial of Joseph Cardinal Mindszenty, who was forced to testify in a Hungarian court that he was a spy. And then later, the Korean War, with the coerced and mainly fraudulent confessions of American servicemen.
My information took place on the...
That would spark intense interest in intelligence circles about brainwashing. The CIA secretly commissioned a study of communist brainwashing methods at the Cornell University Medical Center. A leader of that study was Dr. Lawrence Hinkle. He explains first the Russian method of controlling and breaking a person.
Absolutely isolated from everyone else, with one man whose job it is to get you to write the extent to which you are a criminal. In this setting, you can get people to do most anything, do you see? Because you don't have to lay a hand on them. And by the time you get through and you go up before the judge, the fellow says, "Were you a spy?" He says, "Yes, I was a spy." The Chinese never really had this kind of a state police system. They would get him in, and all this fellow does is ask you to write, rewrite, and talk to him about your whole life.
Graduated from pilot training in 1949.
While the purpose of the study was to find out about communist brainwashing techniques, CIA documents show that the agency was interested in developing mind control methods of its own to precondition and control Chinese living in this country to be sent back to their homeland as CIA agents. What do you think they were looking for?
Well, I think they weren't looking for agents or anything like that.
Yet the agency's perception of the work you were doing, in CIA documents we have examined, it says that the project that was being done here, they intended to use everything learned about the new agents to induce them to, quote, to perform acts of a complex, purposeful nature.
Yeah, but that was never done.
The effects of which may be out of keeping with the individual's previous behavior.
That sort of thing was never done. Those people were not. That was when they first came here. The first people they sent up to see us, you see, were operational type people from the CIA with some rather wild ideas.
Okay, this is their perception of it. If I could just continue.
No, it wasn't their perception of it either. No, it wasn't.
Dangerous to his being, contrary to any previous consciously expressed intentions and interests, contrary to the good of the individual, and subversive to the goals for which he is consciously working.
I understand all this talk. But the situation was, you see, those things were never done because of wise people on both sides. We were not able to do this nor interested in it.
They were, though.
Some of the low-level people were, but the high-level people were not, to tell you the truth.
But documents clearly show that the CIA was attempting to develop agents over whom they had as much control as possible. Agents who would perform tasks contrary to their own good.
Normally conditioned American who's been trained to kill and then to have no memory of having killed. His brain has not only been washed, as they say, it has been dry cleaned.
Is a Manchurian candidate, controlled by others to do things against his will, possible?
It was a remarkable film because, as far as I'm concerned, it made something totally impossible seem absolutely credible.
I would say the answer is yes, but there are many qualifications to that.
Dr. Milton Klein, a psychologist, a clinical and experimental hypnotist, and unpaid consultant to the CIA.
The qualifications would be the subject selected to produce the kind of behavior that you wish, the amount of time, the procedures that are utilized, and the motivations of the people who are designing, executing, and administering the procedures. You're asking whether an individual can be, under hypnosis, influenced, coerced, persuaded, shaped to perform an antisocial act, or a destructive act, or an act of violence. My answer would be yes.
Captain Marco, will you be good enough to lend Raymond your pistol, please? Yes, ma'am.
Thanks, Ben.
Sure, kid. Shoot Bobby, Raymond. Through the forehead.
Yes, ma'am.
How valuable a tool can hypnosis be in the intelligence field?
None whatsoever. It has absolutely no use because nobody's ever been able to do that I know of, do it in an operationally feasible way. I'm not in any way saying that hypnosis doesn't take place. I'm not saying there's nothing to it.
I would say that most government agencies concerned with intelligence operations have been looking to hypnosis as a tool for a variety of purposes, one of which is to carry out and to execute certain intelligence operations on a basis where they would not have to rely completely on some of their own emotional reactions. Actually,
would that entail murder?
It could, if you consider that an act of killing someone under circumstances of war is murder. I think one has to define what that means.
Under circumstances of peace.
Under circumstances of peace, it would be murder.
Another former CIA agent says that Fidel Castro at one time was considered as a possible target for a Manchurian candidate.
Castro was naturally our discussion point. Could you get somebody gung-ho enough that they would go in and get him? But if you have 100% control of a guy, you have 100% dependency. If something happens and you haven't programmed it in, you've got a problem.
So in the end, it was decided that a Manchurian candidate was not feasible. But the search for mind control continued. But could the mind be controlled? Perhaps not. But is human behavior predictable? In this area, the CIA did make a significant breakthrough. A personality assessment system designed by the agency's chief psychologist, John Gittinger. It comes close to being able to predict how humans will behave.
It's really a descriptive system, an attempt to try to describe personality in a relatively systematic way so that hopefully you can get some kind of an idea to predict what the behavior between different kinds of individuals.
Gittinger's system had many uses in intelligence work. One was to draw personality portraits of world leaders. Using Gittinger's system, the agency concluded the Shah of Iran is a brilliant but dangerous megalomaniac whose basic problems resulted from an overbearing father. And there were other applications. Your assessment staff played a key role in helping other governments pick their police intelligence agencies, including, we've learned, the Korean CIA, Uruguayan National Police. Can you tell us about this?
No.
Author John Marks,
the former #2 CIA man in Uruguay, told me how in 1966 John Gittinger and an assistant traveled down to Uruguay and gave the tests in order to select members of the Uruguayan intelligence service. A psychologist who used to work for the CIA told me in 1961 he personally traveled to South Korea as part of an American CIA effort to set up the Korean CIA and to give the personality tests to candidates for the Korean CIA to choose the best man for their secret police.
But one of the basic functions of Gittinger's system was finding the vulnerabilities of an agent, a double agent, or a potential agent. In its applicability to intelligence work, isn't the PAS system looking for a person's soft spot?
Well, of course, the answer to that is yes, but I hasten to say soft spot. This is what I consider a negative word.
Of the hundreds of behavioral projects undertaken by the CIA, Gittinger's appears to have been one of the more successful and more conventional. Other experiments were not as conventional. Neurophysicist Dr. Jose Delgado was financed by the Office of Naval Research. In this experiment, the bull is sedated. Electrodes are implanted in its brain. Delgado transmits an electronic impulse to the center of the bull's brain. Delgado has remote control of the animal. Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man. Other areas were examined through the 60s and 70s. Brain surgery, psychosurgery, creation of amnesia, parapsychology, manipulation of genes. Even though past and present CIA officials have indicated this kind of work ended in 1963.
Whole truth, nothing but...
And one of those who took part in these programs.
Thank you, sir.
In 1977, the Senate subcommittee heard testimony from many of them, but the testimony was not that revealing. According to one of them, they agreed amongst themselves to keep the inquiry within bounds that would satisfy the committee. Former narcotics officer Charles Siragusa says that he was asked to limit his testimony by the man he reported to at the CIA.
He wanted me not to say anything.
To perjure yourself.
That's right. Well, either that, I'd have to perjure myself or take the Fifth Amendment. And I'm not about to take the Fifth Amendment for anybody.
Okay. Former CIA chemist Robert Lashbrook testified he had no first-hand knowledge of the agency-run safe houses when, in fact, he supervised one of them.
There was very little...
And according to George White's diaries, was at a safe house when White conducted what he called an LSD surprise experiment. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, whom we recently filmed near his California home, oversaw many of the CIA behavioral programs. He retired in 1973 and destroyed the records of this work. In sort of a valedictory letter, Dr. Gottlieb wrote that he and his colleagues had been able to maintain contact with the leading edge of developments in the field of biological and chemical control of human behavior. Dr. Gottlieb also testified before the Senate subcommittee, but from an anteroom where he could not be filmed because of what his lawyer termed health and cardiac problems. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview. And what of George White, the man who helped the agency in so many of its programs? He would retire here to Stinson Beach, California. And shortly before his death, he wrote to his boss at the CIA, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, and summed up his career by saying, "It was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, and cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?"
Now, one of the most frequently cited cases is Frank Olson. Olson was an Army scientist working on biological warfare research. In 1953, he attended what he believed was a routine government retreat. At that meeting, he was secretly given LSD. He wasn't told, and he didn't consent. And shortly afterward, his mental state began to deteriorate. 9 days later, he fell from a hotel window in New York and died. At that time, his death was explained as a suicide connected to a nervous breakdown. It wasn't until decades later that the CIA acknowledged Olson had been unknowingly dosed with LSD prior to his death, leading to a formal apology from President Gerald Ford to his family. Now I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is where the story stops being abstract and becomes personal. By the early 1970s, MKUltra had been running for roughly 2 decades, and then something happened that would shape everything that came after it. In 1973, as CIA Director Richard Helms was leaving office, he ordered the destruction of MKUltra records. Not partial records, not selected files, the records. Sidney Gottlieb oversaw the destruction of more than 150 separate files related to the program. Many other documents were destroyed as well before he retired. There was at least one internal objection raised by a CIA records official. It was noted and then ignored. The destruction went forward anyway. Now, you can interpret that in a few ways, depending on where you start from. But the basic fact remains the same. A massive classified program involving human experimentation was followed by a deliberate effort to erase the paper trail. And once that happened, everything that came after, every investigation, every hearing, every reconstruction of events, was forced to work with an incomplete record.
To me, it's not a coincidence that the same people who are in the paperwork at the congressional hearing on MKUltra in the 70s, their names show up in alien abduction narratives. This was a program that grew out of CIA and a few other government agency efforts to produce drugs for different purposes.
Even if you don't know the history of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, it looks like a natural setting for a movie. A horror movie, maybe. But then, the truth about what happened to hundreds of psychiatric patients there a long time ago is a horror story. A renowned psychiatrist at the Allen in the early 60s. His name was Dr. Ewan Cameron.
Dr. Cameron.
It's the classic story of good turning to evil in its most simplistic terms. I mean, Dr. Cameron started off as someone who was probably one of the most enlightened psychiatrists in the country. But then something happened. And whatever happened, suddenly here is this enlightened doctor, this noble doctor, who begins doing more and more and more bizarre experiments on his patients to the point where he is destroying the minds of hundreds of people.
These are the days and hours are the occasions.
Inspired by the exuberant post-war optimism in technology, Cameron thought he'd achieved a major scientific breakthrough: how to repair a damaged human mind. The media rejoiced, even coined a phrase which would become a tragically silly oxymoron: beneficial brainwashing. Linda MacDonald was a young mother with 5 children under the age of 5 when she started feeling low. Her family doctor knew just the man to make her better.
I was tired, I was depressed, my back was hurting. And so he said to the children's father, why don't you go to Montreal and visit this Dr. Ewan Cameron, this famous man who has all of these accolades, and have an assessment. So we went. My medical file even says that I took my guitar with me. And that was the end of my life. Within 3 weeks, Dr. Cameron decided to call me an acute schizophrenic and ship me up to the sleep room.
How long did they put you to sleep for?
I was in a coma for 86 days.
86 days of unbroken sleep.
Yeah. Total comatose state.
The theory was simple: erase a disturbed mind and start all over again. One of Dr. Cameron's colleagues at the time was Dr. Peter Roper.
The aim, I think, really was to wipe out the patterns of thought and behavior which were detrimental to the patient, which were sick, and replace them with healthy patterns of thought and behavior. I think this may have been stimulated by the effects of the American prisoners of war in Korea, how they seem to have been brainwashed.
One technique for brainwashing: extreme sessions of electroshock therapy, massive jolts of electricity 3 or 4 times a day for weeks. According to her hospital records, Linda MacDonald had 100 of these treatments. She entered hospital for treatment of what we can now guess was postpartum depression. Her records show the results of shock and radical drug therapy. May 15th shows some confusion. June 3rd knows her name, but that's about all. June 11th doesn't know her name.
I had to be toilet trained. I was a vegetable. I had no identity. I had no memory. I'd never existed in the world before. Like a baby. Just like a baby that has to be toilet trained.
She eventually went home, her depression gone, and her entire previous life gone with it.
And this is one of the twins. It was in '62 before I went to the Allen. And this is the same one, I think. I just look at the pictures and I know who that is, who they are, but I don't remember them as my children at all. I mean, I know that they came from my body, but there's no, that's all. I don't know, and that's because I was told that. So these are my children.
Robert Logie was little more than a child himself when he was referred to Dr. Cameron. He was 18. He had a sore leg. His doctor thought it was all in his head and sent him to the Allen. Like Linda MacDonald, he went through a nightmare of shock therapy and drugs, including LSD.
Well, I was given LSD about every second day and injected. And sometimes it was mixed with sodium amytal and other drugs.
It really began in the pursuit of a truth serum, believe it or not. In the 50s, there was a lot of effort put into, can we come up with a drug that forces people to tell the truth? And if we can do that, can we use that and take that drug and experiment on our own people to build up a resistance in case they're ever captured? Well, part of that research, people discovered that when you traumatize an individual, the natural coping mechanism of the brain will dissociate. And we all experience dissociation in our own lives in very minor ways. You're driving down the road, it's a fairly long trip, you get to your destination, you can't quite remember how you got there, but you know you're there. Okay, your mind went somewhere else. Well, the people in this program discovered that you could deliberately do this to people and have part of their mind essentially split off. And then it was ready for programming. You could give it instructions. This used to be called multiple personality disorder. It could either be done deliberately in a lab, or it's what the brain did when the person was like ritually abused or repeatedly abused, all sorts of different contexts.
The first real crack in the silence came in 1975. By that point, the United States was already deep into a different kind of crisis. Watergate had shaken public trust in government, and Congress was suddenly willing to ask questions it hadn't seriously asked before. That's when the Church Committee began its investigation into intelligence abuses. Around the same time, the Rockefeller Commission was doing similar work from a different angle. And almost by accident, MKUltra came back into the view. But there was a problem. The files weren't really there anymore. 2 years earlier, in 1973, most of the official documentation had been destroyed. So investigators weren't looking at a complete record. They were working from fragments. Testimony, memory, financial traces, and whatever scattered references could still be recovered. In other words, they were trying to reconstruct a full program from the edges of what survived. Then something unexpected happened. In 1977, a CIA archivist processing a routine Freedom of Information Act request came across something that shouldn't have survived. 7 boxes of financial records. Not research notes, not operational files, just budget and accounting material tied to MKUltra projects. And here's the strange part, as if that wasn't strange enough. Those boxes survived because they were misfiled. They had been stored under financial classifications instead of program classifications, which meant they were never pulled during the 1973 destruction order. Sometimes history doesn't survive because it was protected. Sometimes it survives because someone put it in the wrong folder. Those 7 boxes changed everything. They contained project numbers, funding flows, institutional links, and references to universities, hospitals, and outside researchers. For the first time since the destruction, investigators had something concrete to work with. Not guesses, not recollections. Paper. That discovery directly led to the Senate hearings in 1977. And this is where MKUltra stops being a rumor and becomes a documented administrative reality.
The government decided to explore this area of research, and one of the programs that did that was known as MKUltra. If you've ever seen the movie Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson, he is an MKUltra victim in the movie. Manchurian Candidate. That is classic MKUltra mind manipulation, mind transformation, and programming. It's a big theme in a lot of movies. And it was discovered to be in existence and explored by Congress in the 70s. Most of the evidence for it was destroyed prior to the church hearings. That's what the hearings were called, but someone found 18 or 20 boxes that they had missed, and that's why we know about it.
Suitable for brainwashing, or as Cameron preferred to call it, de-patterning. Then, during the long sleep, the patient would be forced to listen to subliminal messages that were supposed to print new, sometimes bizarre thoughts on his blank mind.
I was aware of the speaker under my pillow. I was aware of the words.
Which were?
You killed your mother.
You killed your mother?
Yeah.
Who was alive and well?
Who was alive and well. And
over and over again, this voice is
well, like I say, it takes about 2 seconds to say that message. And this was going on for 23 days. And when I went home, after being there, and when I went home, my mother was there, and why was she there? And it didn't make any sense.
So what was going on here? Dr. Ewan Cameron was at one point head of the World Psychiatric Association and is still admired by some of his former colleagues. Dr. Peter Roper.
What is the possibility that we had a good, well-motivated man whose ego and ambition took charge of his professionalism and led him into some fairly dark places?
Well, I would put that chance as pretty slight. I think it's more likely that if he'd been around to defend himself when this story came out, we'd have a totally different picture of it.
What would he say? Put yourself in his shoes. What would he say?
I think he'd say, look, I treated these patients to the best of my ability. I didn't get all of them well, but most of them I got better than they were.
Many of his patients, inaccurately diagnosed as schizophrenics, were permanently damaged by his methods. Eventually, even Cameron had doubts about his experiments. He left the Allen in 1964, died of a heart attack 3 years later. By then, the hospital had quietly abandoned the experiments.
You can't walk away!
Nobody knows for sure exactly how many people Dr. Cameron and his colleagues exposed to the program of chemical and electroshock treatment they called de-patterning and psychic driving, a process which some experts have since called barbaric. But many years would pass before there would be any public or official acknowledgement of what those damaged patients had been through. It would take a dramatic disclosure in the late 70s that the Allen Memorial had been part of a Cold War program of brainwashing experiments, paid for in part by the CIA. Hidden among its most sensitive files were CIA records documenting a project called MKUltra, Between 1957 and 1961, a CIA front funneled about $62,000 U.S. for brainwashing research by Dr. Ewan Cameron. The American media got the story first, but the Fifth Estate exposed the magnitude of the human tragedy.
Experimental drugs, including LSD, were administered to human guinea pigs. The patients were never told that their treatment was part of a CIA experiment.
I don't think we'll have radishes.
One of those patients was Velma Orlico of Winnipeg. She'd been at the Allen in the late 50s for treatment of depression. She happened to be married to a member of Parliament, David Orlico of the NDP. She'd considered Dr. Cameron a near saint. Now she was being told she'd been betrayed by him.
It was an awful feeling to realize when I found this out that the man whom I had thought cared about what happened to me didn't give a damn. I was a fly. Just a fly.
First, she felt hurt. Then she got angry and decided to sue one of the most powerful institutions in the world, the CIA.
As a matter of fact, when she said she wanted to sue the CIA, I said, "You're crazy. How can a hick from Winnipeg sue the CIA?"
But she did, along with 8 other former patients, a massive lawsuit that would consume many years and become an obsession for a distinguished American civil liberties lawyer named Joseph Rao.
Cameron, all he did was what the CIA was in effect asking him to do, and what he said he was going to do, and he did it.
Rao and a young assistant named James Turner knew they were up against a formidable opponent in the CIA, but they thought the odds would be evened a bit by help from a natural ally. They were in for a disappointment.
But we expected to have a very potent ally in the form of the Canadian government. And unfortunately, instead of helping their own citizens because the Canadian government was worried about its possible liability, the Mulroney government, in effect, stabbed its citizens in the back at every turn in the litigation.
Ottawa actually helped suppress a key piece of information, evidence that CIA officials at the U.S. Embassy had actually apologized to the Canadian government when the CIA experiments were first revealed. Jim Turner is still flabbergasted.
You got to understand how important these apologies and expressions of regret were. This is an admission. This is legally admissible in court because it is one of the parties to the litigation saying, "I did something wrong and I'm sorry I did it." That is prima facie evidence of negligence and of wrongdoing that goes a long, long way to bringing the case to a timely conclusion instead of the protracted 10 years of litigation that we had.
Lawmakers began questioning CIA personnel under oath. Sidney Gottlieb himself eventually testified. Now, that doesn't mean the picture became complete. It didn't. But it did confirm something important. MKUltra was not hypothetical. It was no longer a conspiracy theory. It was not exaggerated. It was real, structured, and far more extensive than the public had been told. And it didn't stop at the United States. One of the most disturbing parallel tracks was already unfolding in Canada. At McGill University in Montreal, at the Allen Memorial Institute, a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron was conducting experiments that, in hindsight, aligned closely with the MKUltra funding streams. Cameron believed mental illness could be treated by essentially dismantling the human personality and rebuilding it from scratch. He called the process de-patterning. In practice, that meant something much more severe. Patients were placed into extended drug-induced comas, some lasting days, some lasting weeks. They were subjected to repeated electroshock treatments, often at intensities well beyond standard clinical practice at the time. And during or after these states of extreme psychological disruption, they were played repetitive audio recordings, sometimes for hours or days at a time, in an attempt to overwrite behavior and memory. Cameron referred to these atrocities as psychic driving. Some patients later reported profound memory loss. Some lost basic functional skills. Some no longer recognized family members. Now, it's important to be precise here. Cameron's work was not entirely funded by the CIA, but MKUltra linked funding did flow into his research through intermediary organizations. At the same time, Canadian government funding also supported parts of the work, which creates a complicated picture that doesn't fit neatly into a single narrative. And that's often how these programs actually look when you pull them apart. Not one clean line of intent, but overlapping institutions, funding streams, and scientific theory that gets pushed further than anyone originally admits.
There are some very key names that show up in that literature, that set of hearings, and alien abduction research or events. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So when I look at the subject, I think it's wicked. I think it's evil. I think people are deliberately abused in half a dozen different contexts. And this is the outcome.
Of the CIA in Canada. With the publicity wave gathering momentum and the strength of the victim's case becoming more apparent, the CIA caved in the day before the trial was to begin. They settled out of court for $750,000. At the time, it was the largest settlement the CIA had ever awarded.
Here you've got 9 little Canadian victims taking on probably the most powerful institution in America, the CIA, and these little Canadians, they win. They get the CIA to settle and give them money and, in effect, an apology saying what we did is wrong.
But the story didn't end there. Troubling questions would persist, especially about the government of Canada. Dr. Cameron's experiments were funded to the tune of $500,000 by the Federal Department of Health and Welfare during the 50s, and the funding didn't stop then. They kicked in over $51,000 after the CIA project ended in 1961, which was when a young, stressed-out mother named Linda MacDonald became part of the Allen Memorial story. When she discovered that her own government had been funding brainwashing experiments on her, she made a dramatic decision.
You decided to take on the government of Canada.
Oh, sure. Well, hey, considering what I'd already been through, that was a snap. You know, what else? Why not?
It must have become obvious to you fairly quickly that you were ramming your head into a brick wall.
Yes. I'm stubborn, too. It got to the point where every time, whether it was John Crosby or Raina Titian or then the Honorable Kim Campbell, it got to be, you guys, we're gonna stay alive. And I said that to Brian Mulrooney, too. If you think I'm going away, you've got another thing coming. I'm not going to go away.
I finally discovered...
Linda MacDonald would hound the federal government for 4 years before finally in 1992, Ottawa grudgingly agreed to compensate her and some of Dr. Cameron's other victims $100,000 each in exchange for signing away the right to sue the government or the hospital. But it was an ambiguous victory. Ottawa refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing at the Allen, a conclusion backed up by a legal review of what happened there. The report by a prominent progressive conservative lawyer relied partly on expert advice from Dr. Frederick Grunberg, one of Quebec's leading psychiatrists, who made 2 controversial assertions: that patients hadn't suffered irreparable harm and that they had consented to the treatment.
Well, what I meant is that the patients who were admitted at the Allen Memorial Institute were patients who went in voluntarily. So the sort of consent they gave is what was went on was a sort of general consent to the hospital. The sort of consent that was given for surgery or for any other procedure.
Consent had nothing to do with it. Dr. Cameron did not describe the treatment. He did not clarify. He did not give any way, shape, or form any kind of a hint of what was going to happen. That's not consent. And I don't even know whether he talked to me because I'll never remember anyway.
Dr. Grunberg shares a widely held view in his profession about the legacy of Dr. Ewan Cameron.
I think he was a misguided man. He worked on a sort of a poor theoretical basis, and I think he was imprudent, considering. But I am convinced, and I'm still convinced, that he really wanted a therapeutic breakthrough. He had this motivation that he was going to break this terrible condition.
You seem to be saying the things that Cameron did were awful, but he meant well, so we'll forgive him. And the victims or the patients will have to live with the consequences.
It's not a question of forgiving. As I say, the thing is, we put what he was doing in the perspective of his time. And a lot of awful things were going on.
A lot of people are saying, considering the accepted practice and the science available at the time, this was an appropriate thing to do to you. What?
It wasn't treatment, if that's what you're suggesting. It wasn't treatment for anything, not a toenail or anything. It was out and out guinea pigs for brainwashing experiments. That's what it was.
It's been more than 33 years since the Allen put an end to the practices initiated by its most notorious doctor. It has recovered its world-class reputation as a leader in the treatment of mental illness. Dr. Peter Roper was dismissed from the Allen 2 years after Dr. Cameron left. One of the reasons, he insisted on following Dr. Cameron's technique.
By the 1980s and early 1990s, the legal consequences of all this began to surface more directly. Former patients began filing lawsuits, some against the CIA, some against Canadian institutions. In 1988, the CIA settled a number of claims out of court. Later, in the early 1990s, Canada agreed to compensation programs for survivors, although often framed in humanitarian rather than legal terms. And even then, the language matters, because governments are very careful about how they acknowledge responsibility. Not because the facts change, but because legal phrasing determines liability. By the mid-1990s, another wave of investigation opened, not directly about MKUltra at first, but about Cold War human experimentation more broadly. The investigative reporting exposed cases involving radiation experiments conducted on civilians. That public pressure led to a federal advisory review process under the Clinton administration, aimed at uncovering how widespread non-consensual human experimentation had been across multiple agencies. And what investigators began to realize was this: MKUltra wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was part of a larger pattern of Cold War-era experimentation that crossed institutional boundaries. Some involving drugs, some involving radiation, some involving psychological manipulation. Different programs, different agencies. Same underlying assumption: that national security justified extreme methods in the name of research.
John Mack at Harvard, he compared it to shamanistic experiences. And we might even think of something like the Stockholm Syndrome, when you begin to identify with your captors and you feel special. You're chosen. Even though this was awful, they did it for a good reason. And I'm now their messenger. And this is where you get messaging. You have a message now to give to humankind about the world's destiny, about what we need to do to evolve. I think it's deeply sinister. I think some of it could actually be overtly demonic. In other words, the mechanism that produces this set of memories can be different.
To continue the depatterning of your patients.
Well, I felt that I had a duty to my patients to give them the best possible treatment. And if there were some that were not responding to any other form of treatment, the only thing left was depatterning for them, then I felt that should be done.
You sound almost nostalgic for the 50s and 60s.
Oh no, it's not nostalgia. It's a question, I think, that bothers a lot of doctors, but it's rather sad if they're prevented from having that treatment because of administrative, political, or other reasons which have nothing to do with good medical practice.
For Linda MacDonald, good medical practice in 1963 turned an emotional crisis into a horror that would haunt a lifetime.
Here we are. This feels strange.
This spring, she returned to the Ottawa High School, where she graduated in 1957.
Hi, Linda. I'm Ann Argue Highland. How are you?
Hi.
I was in the Liars Club. I don't know if you remember.
I don't remember at all.
No, I guess not.
And all of these people, we knew all of these people.
She has no memory of this place or those times, or even of who she was back then.
Oh, there I am. Look at me. Did they call me Linda?
Yeah. I am who I am today. My family tells me that I am very much like the Linda that they knew when I was growing up.
And once that broader pattern becomes visible, MKUltra stops looking like a single historical event. It starts looking like one chapter in a much larger institutional mindset. Which brings us forward, because even after all of those investigations, hearings, and settlements, the story still didn't end. It resurfaced again in 2026.
I personally have two friends who focus on abduction research. They've documented over 100 cases where they will either lead someone to Christ or train a person to make it a spiritual confrontation when whatever is happening to them happens, and they have been delivered from repeated abduction experiences. In other words, they stop. If that's successful, to me that says there's some inherent spiritual element to this particular thing within this big umbrella world we call UFO stuff. But since it's inherently spiritual and it's evil and it's wicked, a lot of UFO researchers are the enemies of the whole subject. They think it's contrived or they think it's abusive. They don't think it has anything to do with aliens at all.
So how does MKUltra end up back in a congressional hearing in 2026? The short answer is, it didn't really end at all. It just kept resurfacing whenever new fragments of information broke through the surface. This time, the immediate trigger wasn't a whistleblower or a declassified archive dump. It was a renewed round of attention around older CIA documentation connected to Project Artichoke and overlapping behavioral research programs from the same Cold War era. One particular document drew attention because it referenced the ideal of using medical procedures, specifically something framed as a vaccination scenario, as a cover for administering a substance during an interrogation setting. Now, I want to slow down right here because this is where interpretation starts to move faster than evidence if you're not careful. That document is real. But what it describes is a proposed operational concept inside a broader intelligence framework. Not proof of widespread covert vaccination campaigns tied directly to MKUltra in the present day. Those are not the same thing. Still, once a document like that enters public circulation, it tends to take on a life of its own. And that's exactly what happened. Media coverage amplified it, online discussion amplified it further, and eventually it reached members of Congress, including Representative Anna Paulina Luna, who chairs the House Task Force on Declassification of Federal Secrets. That task force has been working through a wide range of historically sensitive material, ranging from JFK assassination records to the ever so popular UAP-related documentation. So MKUltra naturally fits into that broader category of unresolved or partially declassified Cold War intelligence activity. And so, a new hearing was scheduled. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that this hearing didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a larger, modern trend where Congress periodically revisits legacy intelligence programs. Not necessarily because new criminal activity has been confirmed, but because new documents continue to surface in archival review processes. In this case, lawmakers were told that additional MKUltra-related materials had recently been identified in CIA holdings. According to statements made during the process, these materials were undergoing classification review for potential release. At the time of the hearing, the contents were not publicly disclosed in full. Which means, once again, the public was placed in a familiar position. Partial visibility, incomplete information, and a lot of speculation filling in the gaps. Now, depending on where you stand, that can mean very different things. Some people interpret it as evidence that there is still a deeper undisclosed history waiting to be uncovered. Others see it as the normal process of archival declassification slowly catching up to historical events that happened decades ago. Both interpretations tend to show up in the same conversation, and that tension between what is confirmed and what is inferred is basically the center of gravity for MKUltra discussions today. The hearing itself included three main witnesses. Historian Stephen Kinzer, whose work on Sidney Gottlieb and CIA covert operations is widely cited. Investigative journalist Tom O'Neill, known for his long-term research into the Manson case and surrounding intelligence error overlaps. And Dr. Elizabeth Genexi, a public health researcher who appeared as a minority witness from the National Institutes of Health context. From the beginning, the framing of the hearing was direct. Chairwoman Luna characterized MKUltra as one of the most severe documented abuses of federal authority in modern U.S. history, and criticized the destruction of records in 1973 as a major obstacle to historical accountability. That point, at least in terms of historical record, is not controversial. The destruction of MKUltra files is well documented. What remains debated is not whether it happened, but what exactly was lost in the process. Kinzer's testimony stayed close to established archival history. He described Sidney Gottlieb as a central figure in the CIA's behavioral research efforts and characterized aspects of MKUltra experimentation as falling under what would now be considered unethical human subject research. Tom O'Neill's testimony took a different angle. His work, especially in Chaos, explores intersections between intelligence-adjacent research programs, psychiatric experimentation, and cultural events of the 1960s. During the hearing, he acknowledged something important that often gets blurred in public discussion. He has not been able to produce definitive evidence that figures like Charles Manson were formally operating as CIA assets. Not for lack of effort, but because the documentary record does not support that conclusion. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first glance, because it separates investigative correlation from verified operational fact. And that line is where a lot of MKUltra discourse tends to drift. O'Neill's position, at least as stated under questioning, was careful. He described overlaps, associations, and institutional proximity, but stopped short of claiming direct operational control where evidence does not exist. And that's where the hearing starts to reveal something broader than MKUltra itself. Because at a certain point, the conversation is no longer just about one program. It becomes about how people interpret incomplete historical records. What counts as evidence? What counts as inference? And where the boundary between the two should be actually drawn. That's not just a historical question. It's a methodological one. And it doesn't just apply to MKUltra. It applies to any classified program where full documentation no longer exists. As the hearing progressed, another shift became visible. A portion of the discussion began moving away from historical MKUltra documentation and towards broader questions of government trust, modern institutional transparency, and public health policy debates. Some observers noted afterward that this drift away from historical focus reduced the time spent on archival recovery questions. Others saw it as a natural extension of the committee's broader mandate on federal secrecy and public accountability. Both interpretations exist in the record of commentary surrounding the hearing itself. What is not in dispute is that MKUltra, once again, became a focal point for larger questions about how governments manage information, both past and present. By the end of the session, no new classified revelations were publicly confirmed in detail. Instead, lawmakers reiterated that additional MKUltra-related materials remained under review and may be released through ongoing declassification processes. No timeline was provided. Which brings the story back to a familiar position. Partial disclosure, incomplete archival recovery, and a historical record that continues to evolve slowly, decades after the original program supposedly ended. And that leaves us in the same place the story has returned to many times before. Not a conclusion, but at a new threshold between what is known and what is suspected, and what may still be waiting in the archives. So where does that leave us? Probably in the same place this story always seems to leave us. Some answers on the table, a long trail of documented evidence, and still a number of gaps that nobody has been able to fully close. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where MKUltra tends to split into two different directions depending on who's watching. On one side, you have people who see MKUltra as proof that nearly every modern institutional problem can be traced back to a hidden intelligence program. On the other side, you have people who treat it as a closed historical case, something contained in the past, fully understood, and no longer relevant. And honestly, neither of those positions really holds up well under scrutiny. The documented history is clear enough. The CIA ran a large-scale behavioral research program. It involved multiple institutions. It involved human experimentation that, by modern standards and even by many standards of the time, crossed serious ethical lines. And it involved the destruction of records that would otherwise have clarified exactly how far certain projects went. Those are not points of speculation. Those are established facts. But what those facts mean is where interpretation begins. And interpretation is where things tend to drift. So I think the more grounded way to approach MKUltra is not as a single story with a single conclusion, but as a case study in how secrecy behaves over time. Because once you step back, a pattern starts to emerge. Investigations happen, fragments of records are recovered, testimony fills in some of the gaps, public hearings bring portions of the story into the open, and then, almost inevitably, the archive runs out again. Not because nothing else exists, but because what remains is still classified, lost, or destroyed. And that creates a very specific kind of historical environment. One where certainty becomes difficult and speculation becomes very easy. Now, I don't think the lesson here is to assume the worst in every case. That leads to its own kind of distortion. But I also don't think the lesson is to assume that everything has already been fully explained. Because MKUltra itself is proof that official records can be incomplete for reasons that have nothing to do with transparency. Sometimes records are lost through negligence, sometimes through deliberate destruction, and sometimes through bureaucratic accidents that only become visible decades later. All of those exist in this story, which is part of what makes it so difficult to draw clean conclusions. So maybe the more useful question isn't what exactly happened in every detail. Maybe the more useful question is something closer to this. How do we handle history when the record is incomplete, but the consequences are still visible? Because MKUltra didn't just disappear when the program ended. It left behind legal settlements, testimony, and institutional reforms. And it left behind a very long-running debate about how much trust should be placed in institutions that have already demonstrated that they are capable of operating in secrecy for extended periods of time. That tension hasn't really gone away. If anything, it has just evolved into new context. Now, as for the most recent wave of tension in 2026, whether or not the newly reviewed files ultimately reveal anything dramatically new remains to be seen. It's entirely possible they will fill in a few more missing details. It's also possible they will simply confirm what is already known in slightly more administrative language. That's often how declassified material actually reads. Not like revelation, more like confirmation with missing pages restored. But either way, the larger story of MKUltra probably won't change dramatically. Because at this point, the core facts are already established. What remains is not the existence of the program, but the edges of it. And those edges are where most of the debate still lives. So I'll leave you with this. Sunlight has a way of forcing systems to account for themselves. Not always immediately, and not always completely, but eventually. And MKUltra is, in many ways, what happens when that process is delayed for far too long. When documentation is destroyed, when oversight arrives late, and when the public is left trying to reconstruct history from whatever fragments survived the fire. Now, maybe the next round of files will add something meaningful to that picture. Maybe they won't. Either way, I'll be watching. And I suspect a lot of other people will be too. Because once a story like this enters the historical record, it doesn't really disappear. It just waits for the next time someone opens the folder and starts reading again.